We don't need poor farmers with ancient tractors wasting everyone's time at a prestigious land auction. The harsh words echoed through the crowded auction hall as 73-year-old Walter Cahill stood motionless, his weathered face flushed with humiliation, before the gathered investors and land developers. But 40 minutes later, when a sleek private helicopter swooped down over the auction house parking lot, Theodore Crawford's condescending smile vanished as the distinguished woman who stepped out introduced herself. "I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cahill, Director of the National Agricultural Preservation Foundation and Walter Cahill's daughter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I believe we need to discuss your dismissal of sustainable farming practices before you finalize this auction." The Golden Valley County Auction House had stood at the crossroads of rural America's transformation for over 70 years. Once a humble gathering place where local farmers traded equipment and occasional parcels of land, it had evolved into a glossy venue where multi-million-dollar properties changed hands between investment firms and agricultural conglomerates. Its renovated interior now featured polished hardwood floors, digital displays of property specifications, and private consultation rooms where deals were negotiated away from public scrutiny. The original farming families who had built the region's reputation as America's breadbasket now found themselves increasingly marginalized in the economic landscape they had helped create. Many had watched helplessly as neighboring farms were absorbed into vast commercial operations, the familiar patchwork of diverse crops replaced by endless fields of commodity grains. Theodore Crawford's quarterly auction events had become the most coveted in the industry. At 54, with his custom-tailored suits and connections to international investors, he had transformed what was once a community-centered exchange into an exclusive marketplace where only the wealthiest players could participate. The auction house's grand hall now featured sophisticated multimedia presentations on investment returns, financial projections displayed on large screens, and a raised platform where Crawford could survey the proceedings with an air of absolute authority. On this crisp October morning, Crawford moved confidently through the gathering crowd, his Italian leather shoes clicking on the hardwood floor as he nodded to familiar faces. Representatives from investment groups, agribusiness, corporations, and foreign buyers seeking to expand their American holdings. A massive banner stretched across the back wall declared, "Premium agricultural assets, maximizing return on investment." "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford announced from the podium, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of an experienced auctioneer, "today we present an extraordinary investment opportunity, the Riverside Valley Agricultural Portfolio. This collection of 12 contiguous properties totaling 3,200 acres of prime farmland includes exceptional water rights, established irrigation infrastructure, and strategic access to major transportation routes. We'll begin the bidding at $30 million. The attendees settled into their plush seats, electronic bidding paddles at the ready. The Riverside Valley was legendary throughout the Midwest for its exceptional fertility, deep, rich soil deposited over millennia by the winding Silver Creek that cut through its center. Acquiring these connected properties would give any operation dominant control over the region's most productive land. Near the back of the room, the heavy oak doors opened quietly, and a solitary figure entered. Walter Cahill, 73, moved with deliberate steps toward an empty seat in the last row. His faded denim overalls and weathered work boots stood in stark contrast to the business attire surrounding him. Calloused hands clutched a worn leather portfolio that bulged with papers and maps accumulated over decades of careful stewardship. Walter's clear blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, surveyed the room with quiet assessment. He recognized faces. Not the current spectators, but ghosts of their predecessors who had gathered in this same building decades ago when it served as a community hub rather than an exclusive marketplace. Back then, farmers had come together to exchange knowledge and support one another through drought and flood. Now those same families were conspicuously absent, replaced by corporate representatives and investment managers. Crawford noticed the newcomer and frowned slightly before continuing his elaborate description of the property's investment potential. He emphasized projected returns of 18% annually when converted from traditional diverse farming to more intensive industrial agriculture operations focused on export commodities. Parcel 4 includes exceptional riparian access, Crawford continued, highlighting aerial photographs on the screen behind him. The water rights alone justify significant premium valuation, particularly given climate projection models for the region. As corporate representatives began raising electronic paddles, increasing the bid in million-dollar increments, Crawford orchestrated the proceedings with practiced precision. He emphasized the rare opportunity to acquire such a significant land position in a single transaction rather than assembling it piecemeal over years. During a brief pause between bids as the price approached $42 million, Walter Cahill raised his hand. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying a surprising strength despite his age. "There's an important watershed conservation easement on the eastern portions of parcels 4 and 7 that restricts certain agricultural practices." A murmur ran through the crowd as Crawford's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, we've thoroughly vetted all legal aspects of these properties. If you're not here to participate in the bidding, I must ask you to refrain from disrupting the proceedings." Walter remained unfazed by the rebuke. "I'm not trying to disrupt anything," he replied calmly. "But I helped establish that conservation easement in 1992. It was registered with the State Environmental Authority to protect the aquifer that supplies drinking water to 5 downstream communities." Crawford's irritation became visible as he addressed the elderly farmer directly. "Sir, our legal team has cleared all titles. Unless you're prepared to participate with a minimum bid increment of $1 million, I must ask you to remain silent during the auction process." Walter persisted quietly but firmly. "The easement exists. Anyone buying that land should know they can't implement industrial-scale operations on approximately 400 acres along the creek. It protects the water supply for thousands of people." The room grew uncomfortably quiet as Crawford stepped away from his podium and approached Walter directly, his voice now carrying a sharp edge that he barely attempted to disguise. "Mr. Cahill, is it? This is a premier investment auction for serious agricultural investors with the capital and vision to maximize these assets. We're not here to debate forgotten agreements or sentimental attachments to outdated farming methods. The legal details have been thoroughly addressed by professionals who specialize in agricultural property law." Riverside Valley wasn't just prime agricultural land. It was the living heart of an entire ecosystem. The 12 properties that made up Crawford's investment portfolio had once formed the core of a tight-knit farming community that had worked in harmony with the land. For generations, the rich bottomland along Silver Creek produced some of the most abundant harvests in the state, when managed with knowledge passed down through families who understood its seasonal rhythms and subtle variations. This wasn't just any auction. Today's sale represented a tipping point for the entire county. If these remaining independently owned farms fell to corporate acquisition, it would complete the transformation that had been underway for 2 decades, the erasure of a sustainable agricultural tradition in favor of industrial monocropping that prioritized short-term profits over long-term stewardship. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The auction house itself embodied this transformation. Originally built in 1937 as a cooperative venture by local farmers seeking a fair marketplace, its weathered wooden beams had been concealed behind sleek drywall and recessed lighting. Historical photographs of founding farm families that once lined the walls had been replaced with abstract art and corporate sponsor logos. Even the ancient oak auction block, where handshakes sealed decades of honest deals, had been discarded in favor of Crawford's computerized podium. Theodore Crawford understood the symbolic power of these changes. His quarterly auctions weren't just business transactions. They were carefully orchestrated performances designed to demonstrate that agriculture's future belonged to those with capital, not those with generational knowledge. The champagne receptions that preceded each auction and the catered lunches that followed them served to remind traditional farmers they no longer belonged in spaces they had once created. Crawford's company, Heartland Asset Management, had facilitated the transfer of over 100,000 acres of family farmland to corporate ownership in the past 5 years alone. His reputation for delivering clean properties, land unburdened by easements, conservation restrictions, or troublesome local relationships, had made him the preferred broker for institutional investors seeking to expand their agricultural holdings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford continued, recovering his professional composure as he returned to the podium, "let me remind you that this portfolio represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The Riverside Valley's exceptional soil profile consistently yields 23% above county averages. The consolidated irrigation infrastructure can be optimized for commodity production with minimal additional investment." On the screens flanking the stage, sophisticated graphics displayed projected revenue models and efficiency metrics. Not once did the presentation mention the families who had stewarded these lands or the agricultural heritage at stake. The land existed purely as a financial asset, its value measured exclusively in production units per acre and return on investment. In the audience, representatives from multinational agricultural corporations studied the materials with calculating eyes. AgriGlobal's senior acquisition manager tapped notes into his tablet, while Continental Harvest's team huddled in whispered consultation. Foreign investment groups, their presence marked by translators who quietly conveyed Crawford's pitch, evaluated the properties against global portfolios. What was conspicuously missing were the faces of local farmers who might have been interested in acquiring portions of the land to maintain independent operations. The $30 million opening bid alone ensured that no family farmer could possibly participate, even if several pooled their resources. This was by design. Crawford's marketing had deliberately targeted institutional investors while providing only the legally required minimum public notice of the auction. At the back of the room, Walter Cahill understood this dynamic all too well. The leather portfolio in his hands contained more than just documentation about water conservation easements. It held the agricultural history of Riverside Valley, rainfall patterns documented across 50 years, soil composition maps created by his father in the 1950s, records of which fields drained first after heavy storms, locations of natural springs that remained productive even during drought years. This knowledge, accumulated across generations and irreplaceable by satellite, imaging or soil sampling technology, was on the verge of being lost, not because it lacked value, but because the new paradigm of agricultural ownership had no mechanism to incorporate wisdom that couldn't be quantified in a prospectus or projected onto a quarterly earnings report. Beyond the auction house windows, the land in question stretched toward the horizon, October had painted the countryside in amber and gold, with the tree-lined Silver Creek cutting a sinuous path through fields newly harvested. To knowledgeable eyes like Walter's, the landscape told stories, which farmers had maintained proper crop rotation, where soil erosion threatened long-term viability, which windbreaks needed reinforcement to protect against the coming winter. 4. Walter, this wasn't simply about preventing industrial practices on the 400 acres covered by the watershed easement. It was about preserving an approach to agriculture that recognized farming as more than resource extraction, that acknowledged obligations to future generations who would depend on this same soil. Crawford's auction system, with its emphasis on consolidated parcels and institutional buyers, threatened this entire agricultural ecosystem. When farms changed hands through these transactions, the first casualties were often the tenant farmers and local workers who had maintained operations for decades. The second were the diverse crop rotations that maintained soil health but delivered less immediate profit than commodity monocultures. The third was the community knowledge base, the collective understanding of how to farm this specific landscape sustainably. As the bidding resumed, electronic paddles raised the price past $45 million. Walter watched as the fate of his community was decided through the clinical exchange of numbers, each increment representing another nail in the coffin of traditional farming in Riverside Valley. $46 million from AgriGlobal, Crawford announced, his voice carrying practiced enthusiasm. Do I hear 47 million? Remember, this assembled portfolio would require years to create through individual acquisitions, if it could be created at all given current market conditions. Walter glanced down at his portfolio, fingers tracing the watershed easement documentation that Crawford's team had somehow overlooked or deliberately concealed. It was a small point of leverage against the overwhelming momentum of industrial consolidation, but it was something, some fragment of the community's ability to determine its own agricultural future. Outside the auction house windows, combines were visible in distant fields, harvesting crops on land already converted to industrial production. Their methodical progress across the landscape paralleled the systematic acquisition of family farms by corporate entities, relentless, mechanical, and seemingly inevitable. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for Walter Cahill or the memory of farming families who had built Riverside Valley, but for the fundamental question of who would control America's food production and how they would steward the land that made it possible. Walter Cahill hadn't come to the auction house to make trouble. At 73, he'd long since passed the age when men seek out public confrontation. The arthritis that stiffened his fingers on cold mornings, and the old back injury that flared up during harvest season had taught him the wisdom of choosing his battles carefully. But some principles transcended personal comfort. His weathered face bore the permanent tan of a man who had spent his life outdoors, with deep creases around his eyes from decades of squinting against the sun and wind. Unlike the auction attendees, in their pressed shirts and polished shoes, Walter's appearance told the story of his life's work. His hands, gnarled and calloused, bore scars from countless repairs to fencing and machinery. The faded blue overalls he wore weren't a costume or affectation, but his daily uniform, as much a part of him as his silver hair and direct gaze. When he had parked his 1992 Ford pickup in the auction house lot that morning, he'd noticed how it stood out among the luxury SUVs and sleek sedans. The truck, like Walter himself, was a relic of an earlier era, meticulously maintained but unmistakably from another time. The bumper sticker reading, "No farms, no food," had faded almost to illegibility after 15 years in the sun. Walter hadn't come representing just himself. Though he sat alone in the auction house, he carried the weight of an entire community's concerns. The Riverside Valley Agricultural Council, now reduced to 11 active members from the 48, who had founded it in 1975, had designated him their representative after an emergency meeting in Earl Peterson's barn 3 days earlier, when news of the auction finally reached them through the required public notice buried in the legal section of the county newspaper. "We're counting on you, Walt," Earl had said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You know that conservation easement better than anybody. Make sure they can't sweep it under the rug." The leather portfolio balanced on Walter's knees contained more than just legal documents. Inside was a hand-drawn map created by his father in 1958 showing the natural springs that fed Silver Creek even during the worst drought in living memory. There were soil composition studies Walter had participated in during his time on the County Conservation Board in the 1990s. Most importantly, there was the Watershed Protection Agreement he had helped draft, with signatures from 3 county commissioners and the State Environmental Authority. This wasn't Walter's first time speaking up against powerful interests. In 1992, he had led local resistance against a proposed chemical treatment facility near Silver Creek. In 2001, he had testified before the State Agricultural Committee about the impact of industrial farming on groundwater quality. Each time, his approach had been the same: quiet persistence based on factual knowledge and genuine concern for the land he loved. The Cahill family had farmed in Riverside Valley since 1887, when Walter's great-grandfather staked his claim to 160 acres along Silver Creek. Over generations, they had gradually expanded to 440 acres, not the largest operation in the county, but respectable and, more importantly, sustainable. They had weathered the Dust Bowl, the farm crisis of the 1980s, and countless other challenges through careful stewardship and community cooperation. Walter had lost his own farm 7 years earlier, not through poor management, but through a perfect storm of adversity. First came his wife Margaret's cancer diagnosis and the crushing medical bills their insurance only partially covered. Then a hailstorm destroyed an entire season's crop the same year their equipment loan came due. The final blow was his son, Michael's death in a farming accident, which drained Walter's will to continue fighting alone. Selling the farm had been the hardest decision of his life. He now lived in a small house on the edge of town, consulting for organic operations and teaching sustainable agriculture courses at the community college. The farm that had been in his family for 4 generations was now part of AgriGlobal's expanding empire, the very company bidding on the Riverside Valley portfolio today. What most in the auction room didn't realize was that Walter Cahill wasn't just some stubborn old farmer clinging to outdated methods. Before returning to take over the family farm when his father's health failed, he had earned a master's degree in agricultural science from the State University. His thesis on sustainable water management in drought-prone regions had been published and cited in academic journals. The outdated methods he advocated were increasingly validated by contemporary research on regenerative agriculture and soil health. As Walter sat quietly observing the auction proceedings, he noticed how Theodore Crawford carefully framed each property in terms calculated to appeal to investment mentality, emphasizing potential conversion value, development opportunities, and tax advantages. Not once did Crawford mention the centuries of careful stewardship that had created and preserved the soil health that made these properties valuable in the first place. When Walter had arrived at the auction house that morning, he had been stopped at the entrance by security personnel who questioned his purpose. "This is a private event, sir," the guard had said, eyeing Walter's work clothes skeptically. "It's a public auction of agricultural land," Walter had replied calmly, producing the newspaper notice from his pocket. "And I'm a member of the public with particular interest in agriculture." The guard had reluctantly allowed him entry, but the message was clear. People like Walter Cahill were no longer welcome in spaces where the future of farming was decided. As he listened to Crawford's polished presentation, Walter observed the reactions of those around him. Most of the corporate representatives paid little attention to the historical context or environmental implications of their potential purchases. They focused exclusively on the financial projections, consulting occasionally with colleagues via text message or whispered conversation. Walter's presence in the back row was an anomaly that created visible discomfort, a physical reminder of the human consequences of these transactions. His weathered face and work-worn hands represented the very farming tradition that corporate agriculture was systematically displacing. His quiet dignity underscored the clinical nature of proceedings that treated land as nothing more than a financial instrument. When he had raised his hand to mention the watershed conservation easement, Walter wasn't being confrontational. He genuinely believed that buyers deserved complete information about the properties they were bidding on, including legal restrictions that might affect their operations. His intervention came not from a desire to disrupt, but from the farmers' inherent sense of fairness and transparency. The dismissive response from Crawford had not surprised him. Walter had witnessed the same pattern repeatedly over the years, the systematic devaluation of agricultural knowledge that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet or converted into immediate profit. What modern agribusiness failed to recognize was that this knowledge represented centuries of practical experience that no computer model could replicate. As Crawford returned to his podium after their brief confrontation, Walter remained composed, his blue eyes calmly surveying the room. He had not come to create a scene. He had come to bear witness to the transfer of his community's agricultural heritage and to ensure that at least one aspect of its protection, the watershed conservation easement, would not be buried in the rush toward consolidation. What none of the auction participants yet realized was that Walter Cahill's presence represented something more significant than one elderly farmer's concerns. He was the visible tip of a much larger movement that had been building quietly throughout the region, a coalition of environmentalists, sustainable agriculture advocates, family farm organizations, and community leaders increasingly concerned about the social and ecological consequences of industrial farming concentration. Walter might appear to be just a solitary figure in faded overalls, but he was anything but alone in his principles. A momentary lull fell over the auction as Crawford returned to his position at the podium, his momentary irritation concealed behind a practiced professional smile. He tapped the microphone lightly, drawing attention back to himself and away from the elderly farmer who had dared to interrupt his carefully orchestrated proceedings. Now, as we were saying before that minor interruption, Parcel 5 includes exceptional access to the county irrigation network and borders the state highway, offering excellent transport efficiency. The adjacent grain elevator facility, while not included in this sale, provides immediate processing capacity. For serious agricultural investors, this combination of factors represents extraordinary value. The digital displays flanking Crawford flashed to new images, aerial photographs highlighting the irrigation infrastructure and transportation access. The bidding resumed as corporate representatives calculated the financial implications of these features, electronic paddles raising the price to $47 million, then $48 million in rapid succession. Walter Cahill remained in his seat, the leather portfolio still open on his lap. He had made his initial point about the watershed conservation easement, but Crawford's dismissal had been exactly what he expected. For decades, he had watched as environmental protections and community interests were treated as inconvenient, obstacles to be overcome, rather than essential safeguards to be respected. As the bidding approached $50 million, Walter raised his hand again. This time, Crawford deliberately avoided looking in his direction, focusing instead on a representative from Continental Harvest who was consulting with colleagues before potentially raising the bid further. "Excuse me," Walter called, his voice carrying clearly despite not shouting. There's another matter regarding water rights on parcels 6 through 9 that potential buyers should be aware of. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Several investors glanced back toward Walter, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and annoyance at the continued interruption. Crawford's jaw tightened visibly as he was forced to acknowledge the second intervention. "Mr. Cahill," he said, not bothering to mask his irritation, "we've already addressed the matter of legal disclosures. All documentation regarding these properties has been made available to qualified bidders during the due diligence period." Walter stood slowly, his movement deliberate but not confrontational. He extracted a set of documents from his portfolio and held them up, maps with blue lines indicating watershed patterns and official-looking papers bearing government seals. In 1997, the State Water Resources Board designated the Silver Creek tributaries as protected headwaters, Walter explained, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. This designation requires maintenance of existing riparian buffers and prohibits certain types of agricultural runoff. The restrictions affect approximately 320 acres across parcels 6 through 9. Crawford's face flushed slightly as several corporate representatives began whispering to each other. A woman in a charcoal business suit, AgriGlobal's lead counsel, was already typing rapidly on her tablet, presumably researching Walter's claim. "Mr. Cahill," Crawford said, his voice taking on an edge of condescension, "these properties have been thoroughly vetted by multiple legal teams specializing in agricultural real estate. If such restrictions existed, they would have been prominently disclosed in our materials." Walter remained calm in the face of Crawford's dismissal. "I served on the Tri-County Water Board for 12 years, he replied. "These designations were registered with both state and federal authorities. They appear in the Geographic Information System database maintained by the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service." The room had grown increasingly uncomfortable. Several bidders were now on their phones, presumably contacting their legal departments for verification. Crawford recognized that he was losing control of the narrative and needed to regain momentum quickly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising his voice slightly to recapture attention, "we will take a brief 15-minute recess to address these concerns. Our legal team will verify all relevant property information to ensure complete transparency. Please enjoy refreshments in the adjacent reception area while we confirm what I'm certain will be the accuracy of our disclosures." As the attendees began filing toward the doors, Crawford descended from his podium and approached Walter directly, maintaining a smile for any observers, but speaking in a low, tense voice. "Mr. Cahill, I don't know what game you're playing, but this auction represents millions in commissions and years of preparation. If you're attempting to depress the sale price to benefit some local farming cooperative, I assure you it won't work." Walter met Crawford's gaze steadily. "I'm not playing any game, Mr. Crawford. I'm simply ensuring that buyers have accurate information about what they're purchasing. These protections exist to safeguard water quality for communities downstream, not to inconvenience your business model." Crawford leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Do you have any idea who these people are? They represent billions in investment capital. They don't have time for lectures about watersheds and conservation easements from—" He glanced pointedly at Walter's worn overalls, "local farmers with outdated concerns." "The watershed doesn't care about investment capital, Mr. Crawford," Walter replied quietly. "Neither do the communities that depend on clean water. These aren't outdated concerns. They're permanent ecological realities that no amount of financial engineering can change." Crawford's professional mask slipped further as his frustration mounted. "We have a room full of serious investors ready to commit significant capital to modernizing these agricultural assets. They don't need complications from sentimental attachments to farming methods that belong in the last century. "These investors deserve to know exactly what they're buying," Walter countered, "including legal obligations that come with the land. That's not sentiment. It's basic business ethics." By now, the auction hall had mostly emptied, with attendees gathering in the reception area where Crawford's assistants were already attempting to reassure them about the proceedings. Crawford glanced toward his legal team, who were huddled around, laptops and tablets, frantically searching property records. "My team will address any legitimate concerns," Crawford said, regaining some of his composure. "But I must ask you to refrain from further disruptions. This is a private business event, not a forum for environmental advocacy." Walter closed his portfolio calmly. "I'm not an advocate, Mr. Crawford. I'm a farmer who helped create these water protections because I understood their importance to long-term agricultural sustainability. If your due diligence missed them, that's concerning for your clients. Wouldn't you agree?" Crawford didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to a security guard who had approached. "Please ensure Mr. Cahill remains in the observation area when we resume. If he attempts to interrupt again, he'll need to be escorted from the premises." As Crawford strode away to consult with his legal team, Walter remained where he stood, unruffled by the confrontation. He had anticipated this response, had experienced similar dismissals many times before when raising inconvenient truths about agricultural practices and their environmental impacts. From the reception area, several auction participants were watching the exchange with interest. Walter noticed representatives from AgriGlobal, in particular, paying close attention, the company that now owned his former farm and understood better than most the implications of water protection regulations for industrial agriculture operations. Walter had no illusions about stopping the sale. The economic forces driving agricultural consolidation were too powerful, the financial incentives too compelling for investors seeking stable returns in uncertain markets. His goal was more modest, but perhaps more important, ensuring that whoever acquired these lands understood their responsibilities to the broader ecosystem and the communities that depended on it. The initial confrontation had achieved at least one objective. Crawford's team was now scrambling to verify information they had either overlooked or deliberately omitted. The watershed protections Walter had mentioned weren't minor technicalities. They were substantive legal restrictions that would affect how portions of the land could be used and what agricultural practices could be implemented. As the 15-minute recess stretched to 20 minutes, then 25, Walter took a seat near the back of the now empty auction hall, waiting patiently for proceedings to resume. The leather portfolio remained open on his lap, decades of carefully documented knowledge ready to counter any further attempts at dismissal or misdirection. 27 minutes after the unexpected recess began, Theodore Crawford returned to the auction hall, flanked by his lead counsel and 2 security personnel. His earlier irritation had hardened into something more determined as he watched the auction participants filter back to their seats. Several corporate representatives huddled in small groups, casting occasional glances toward Walter, who remained quietly seated in the back row. Crawford approached the podium with measured steps, tapping the microphone to signal the resumption of proceedings. His smile had returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes as he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience during our brief verification process. I'm pleased to report that our legal team has confirmed the complete accuracy of all property disclosures provided in your due diligence packages." He paused, directing his gaze specifically toward Walter before continuing. "It appears there has been some confusion regarding alleged watershed restrictions. Our team has thoroughly reviewed all registered easements and environmental designations. While there was indeed a proposed watershed protection plan submitted to the Tri-County Water Board in 1997, our records indicate it was never formally ratified by the necessary regulatory authorities. Walter's expression remained impassive, though he noted how carefully Crawford had worded his statement. The watershed protections hadn't been proposed, they had been approved and implemented. The documentation in his portfolio confirmed this unequivocally. Now, Crawford continued, his confidence visibly reinforced, let's return to the extraordinary opportunity before us. We had reached a high bid of $50 million from Continental Harvest before the interruption. Do I hear $51 million? Before any paddles could be raised, Walter stood again, the movement drawing all eyes in the room. Mr. Crawford, he said, his voice calm but carrying. The watershed protections were fully ratified on November 12, 1997, with implementation beginning the following spring. I have the signed authorization from the State Water Resources Board right here, complete with the implementation schedule and compliance requirements. The room fell completely silent. Crawford's carefully constructed professional demeanor began to crack as he realized the elderly farmer wasn't going to be so easily dismissed. Mr. Cahill, Crawford said, his voice taking on an edge that he no longer attempted to disguise, this is becoming disruptive to a serious business proceeding. If you have concerns about property disclosures, the appropriate channel is through the regulatory agencies after the auction, not interrupting a live bidding process. Walter held up the document in question. Clearly visible was the official state seal and signatures at the bottom of the page. The appropriate time for full disclosure is before the sale, not after, Walter replied. These bidders deserve to know exactly what they're purchasing, including all legal obligations that come with the land. Crawford stepped away from his podium, motioning to the security personnel who had remained at the edges of the room. As they began moving toward Walter, Crawford addressed the crowd with forced lightness in his tone. It seems we have an unexpected advocate in our midst today. While I appreciate Mr. Cahill's passion for local history, I'm afraid he's confusing preliminary discussions with binding legal commitments. He turned directly to Walter now, no longer bothering to maintain even a facade of respect. Mr. Cahill, this is a premier agricultural investment auction, not a community town hall. These investors have traveled from across the country and around the world to participate in a professional business transaction. They don't need history lessons from someone who clearly doesn't understand the complexities of modern agricultural asset management. A few uncomfortable chuckles rose from the audience, primarily from younger associates eager to align themselves with Crawford's authority. Most of the senior representatives remained silent, watching the confrontation with calculated neutrality. Crawford pressed his advantage, his voice taking on a performative aspect meant for the audience, rather than Walter directly. I understand that watching agricultural modernization must be difficult for certain traditionalists, he said, gesturing toward Walter's worn clothing and weathered appearance. Change is never easy, particularly for those who've spent their lives doing things the same way. But this is a professional investment environment, Mr. Cahill. We don't need subsistence farmers with outdated equipment and obsolete methods interrupting a multi-million-dollar agricultural asset transaction. The deliberate cruelty of Crawford's words hung in the air. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with both Crawford and Walter. The public humiliation was clearly calculated, designed not just to dismiss Walter's concerns, but to discredit him personally before the assembled investors. Walter stood perfectly still, the documents still held firmly in his hand. His face registered the sting of the insult, a momentary flash of hurt quickly replaced by dignity. He had endured far worse than verbal barbs in his 7 decades. Drought, financial hardship, personal tragedy. Crawford's attempt to shame him was painful, but ultimately trivial compared to real suffering. Security, Crawford called, not bothering to look at Walter anymore. Please escort Mr. Cahill from the premises. He's disrupting a private business event. The two security guards, young men in dark suits who looked decidedly uncomfortable with their assignment, approached Walter hesitantly. "Sir," one of them said quietly, "we need to ask you to leave the auction." Walter carefully returned the watershed documents to his portfolio before addressing the young man. "I understand you're just doing your job," he said, his voice steady and respectful. "I'll go peacefully." As the guards prepared to escort him toward the exit, Walter turned to face the room one final time. The investors and corporate representatives were watching with expressions ranging from embarrassment to indifference to thinly veiled amusement. "My equipment may be outdated, Mr. Crawford," Walter said, his voice calm, but carrying throughout the now silent room. "But my understanding of this land and its importance to our watershed isn't. Those protections exist to ensure that future generations will have the clean water they need to survive, regardless of who owns the property today." Crawford had already returned to his podium, deliberately turning his attention to his notes as if Walter were beneath further acknowledgement. The Riverside Valley wasn't assembled through quarterly profit reports or investment prospectuses, Walter continued, speaking now to the room at large rather than just Crawford. It was built by families who understood they were temporary stewards of something permanent, something that deserved respect. One of the security guards gently touched Walter's elbow, indicating it was time to leave. Walter nodded in acknowledgement but finished his thought. "You can dismiss me, Mr. Crawford, but you can't dismiss the legal obligations that come with this land. The watershed protections are real, they are binding, and they will affect how these properties can be used, whether you choose to disclose that fact or not." As Walter was led toward the exit, his straight-back dignity in stark contrast to the public humiliation he had just endured, Crawford attempted to recapture control of the room with forced joviality. "Well, that was certainly an unexpected bit of local color," he said with an artificial chuckle. "Now shall we return to serious business? We were at $50 million. Do I hear $51 million for this exceptional agricultural portfolio?" The room remained uncomfortably silent for several seconds, longer than Crawford had anticipated. Several representatives were now on their phones or tablets, presumably researching Walter's claims independently rather than relying on Crawford's dismissal. For Walter, the sting of public mockery was real, but ultimately secondary to his purpose. As he was escorted through the heavy oak doors of the auction hall, his thoughts weren't on Crawford's cruel words, but on whether he had said enough to make at least some of the bidders investigate the watershed protections for themselves. That had been his goal all along. Not to stop the sale, but to ensure that whoever purchased the land would be fully informed of their responsibilities to the broader ecosystem. What he couldn't know as he was led from the building was that his public humiliation had set in motion forces that would return to the auction hall much sooner than anyone expected, and with consequences that would permanently alter the course of Riverside Valley's agricultural future. The October sunlight felt harsh after the dimmed interior of the auction house. Walter blinked as the security guards escorted him through the main entrance and onto the stone steps leading down to the parking lot. Their grip on his arms was firm, but not rough. They were performing their assigned task without personal animosity. "Sorry about this, Mr. Cahill," the younger guard said quietly as they reached the bottom of the steps. "Just following orders." Walter nodded in acknowledgement. "I understand. You've got a job to do." The guards released his arms once they were clear of the building's entrance. The older of the two hesitated, seeming to wrestle with something before speaking. "My grandfather had a farm over in Marshall County," he said, his voice low enough that only Walter could hear. "Lost it in '98 during the market crash. He always said the hardest part wasn't losing the land, it was watching people who'd never worked soil a day in their lives decide its fate." Walter recognized the confession for what it was, a small act of solidarity disguised as casual conversation. He nodded again, communicating his understanding without putting the man's job at risk. Crawford was out of line in there, the guard continued, glancing back toward the building. For what it's worth. I appreciate that, Walter replied. But I've been called worse by better. The brief moment of connection ended as the auction house doors opened again, and one of Crawford's assistants emerged, scanning the area with obvious purpose. The guards straightened their posture, reverting to professional detachment. "You'll need to leave the property now, sir," the older guard said, loud enough for the approaching assistant to hear. "The auction is a private event." Walter clutched his leather portfolio against his chest and gave a final nod to the guards before turning toward the parking lot where his faded blue pickup waited among the luxury vehicles. He had taken only a few steps when Crawford's assistant called out to him, "Mr. Cahill." Walter turned, his expression questioning but not hostile. The young woman approached briskly, her heels clicking on the pavement. She held out a business card with Crawford's name embossed in gold lettering. "Mr. Crawford asked me to provide his contact information," she said, her voice professionally neutral. "He suggests that if you have documentation regarding watershed restrictions, you should forward it to his legal team rather than disrupting proceedings." Walter accepted the card, without comment, tucking it into his shirt pocket. They both recognized the gesture for what it was. Not a genuine invitation to share information, but a dismissal wrapped in procedural courtesy. As the assistant turned to leave, Walter called after her. "Miss?" She paused, looking back with a slightly impatient expression. "Would you give Mr. Crawford a message for me?" She hesitated before nodding reluctantly. "Tell him those watershed protections aren't just pieces of paper filed in some government office. They represent a promise to future generations that we won't sacrifice their water security for our short-term profit." The assistant's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine curiosity about this stubborn old farmer who refused to be silenced. "Is that all?" she asked. Walter shook his head slowly. "Tell him that those protections exist whether he acknowledges them or not. The land remembers how it's treated even when people with money try to forget." Something in Walter's tone, not angry but resolute, not threatening but prophetic, caused the assistant to study him more carefully. For the first time, she seemed to see beyond the weathered overalls and worn boots to the wisdom and conviction beneath. "I'll tell him," she said finally, her voice softer than before. As she returned to the building, Walter continued toward his truck, moving unhurriedly across the parking lot. From inside the auction house, he could hear Crawford's amplified voice resuming the proceedings, the momentary disruption already being smoothed over with professional patter. Walter reached his 1992 Ford F-150, its blue paint oxidized by decades of sun, but its body still solid and well-maintained. Unlike the vehicles surrounding it, the gleaming SUVs and luxury sedans that would return to climate-controlled garages, his truck was a working vehicle that earned its place in the world through daily utility rather than status signaling. He placed his leather portfolio carefully on the passenger seat before climbing in behind the wheel. For a moment, he simply sat there, feeling the familiar worn contours of the seat that had supported him through countless harvests, equipment repairs, and journeys to agricultural board meetings. Through the windshield, Walter could see the auction house with its newly renovated facade. The building had once been the heart of the farming community, a place where equipment was traded, knowledge shared, and friendships maintained across generations. Now it had become a symbol of agriculture's transformation from community vocation to corporate investment vehicle. He inserted the key, but didn't immediately start the engine. Instead, he unclasped his portfolio and withdrew the watershed protection. Documents that Crawford had so dismissively rejected. The official signatures and seals confirmed what Walter knew with absolute certainty. These protections were legally binding, regardless of Crawford's attempts to minimize or ignore them. What troubled Walter wasn't just Crawford's willful disregard for environmental regulations. It was the broader pattern this represented, the systematic erasure of agricultural knowledge that couldn't be quantified in financial terms. The wisdom of when to plant based on subtle environmental cues, the understanding of how specific fields drained after heavy rains, the knowledge of which windbreaks protected which areas from erosion, all this was being lost as farms were consolidated under corporate management that prioritized standardization over local adaptation. Walter started the truck, its engine catching with the reliable rumble that spoke of careful maintenance despite its age. As he prepared to back out of his parking space, movement near the auction house entrance caught his eye. Several bidders were emerging from the building, engaged in animated conversation and checking their phones. Crawford's assistant was hurrying toward them, her expression suggesting growing concern. Something had disrupted the smooth proceedings inside. Perhaps the watershed protections Walter had mentioned were being independently verified by cautious investors. Walter allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. His goal hadn't been to stop the auction, but to ensure that whoever purchased the land would be fully informed of their responsibilities to the environment and the community. If even a few investors were now questioning Crawford's representations, that small victory might have significant consequences. As he drove slowly past the front of the auction house, Walter noticed Theodore Crawford himself appearing at the entrance, his expression tense as he spoke urgently into his cell phone. Crawford glanced up, momentarily making eye contact with Walter through the truck's window. The auctioneer's face darkened with poorly concealed anger at the sight of the elderly farmer, whose intervention had apparently complicated his carefully orchestrated sale. Walter didn't react beyond a slight nod of acknowledgement. He had no personal animosity toward Crawford. The man was simply a product of a system that valued financial engineering above agricultural stewardship. The real battle wasn't between individuals, but between fundamentally different visions of what land meant and how it should be managed. Turning onto the main road, Walter reached for his own cell phone, an older model that lacked the sleek appearance of modern smartphones but served its purpose reliably. He needed to update the Riverside Valley Agricultural Council on what had transpired, particularly his concerns about Crawford's apparent concealment of the watershed protections. He also needed to make another call, one he had hoped to avoid, but now recognized as necessary. His daughter Elizabeth, the brilliant agricultural scientist whose research on sustainable farming practices had earned international recognition, needed to know what was happening. She had the credentials and authority that Walter lacked in the eyes of corporate investors, the very qualities that might force Crawford to acknowledge the environmental regulations he was trying to minimize. As Walter pulled onto the highway, leading toward town, he glanced in his rearview mirror at the auction house growing smaller in the distance. Crawford clearly believed the disruption had been successfully removed, allowing his profitable transaction to proceed unimpeded. What no one inside that building yet realized was that Walter Cahill's ejection wasn't the end of this confrontation. It was merely the opening move in a much larger challenge to business as usual. The seeds of accountability had been planted, and they would bear fruit far sooner than Theodore Crawford could possibly imagine. Walter drove past the "Welcome to Millfield" sign, its faded paint another small indicator of changing times. This town of 3,800 had once been the proud center of Riverside Valley's agricultural community. Now it was slowly transforming into a bedroom community for the larger city 40 miles east, its agricultural identity gradually being replaced by chain stores and suburban-style developments. He pulled into the parking lot of the Riverside Diner. a local institution where farmers had gathered for decades to exchange information over coffee and homemade pie. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, nodding to Marge behind the counter, who immediately poured a cup of black coffee and set it at his booth by the window without being asked. "Thought you'd be at that fancy auction today, Walt?" she said, sliding the mug toward him as he settled into the familiar vinyl seat. "I was," he replied, placing his portfolio on the table. "It didn't last as long as I expected." Something in his tone made Marge study him more carefully. She'd known Walter for over 30 years, had watched him weather the loss of his wife, his son, and finally his farm with quiet dignity. She recognized the set of his jaw that indicated trouble. "Crawford gave you a hard time." Walter shrugged, slightly. "He's not interested in hearing about watershed protections that might complicate his sale," Marge snorted. "That man would sell his own grandmother if the commission was high enough." She gestured toward the portfolio. "You had the documentation with you?" "Every page," Walter confirmed, patting the worn leather. "Not that it mattered. When money's on the table, papers with government seals are just inconvenient details." The diner was quiet in the mid-afternoon lull between lunch and dinner. Only 2 other tables were occupied, a pair of truckers passing through town and an elderly couple lingering over pie. Walter valued this moment of calm after the confrontation at the auction house, the familiar surroundings offering a reassuring contrast to the hostile reception he'd received earlier. He pulled out his cell phone and placed it on the table beside his coffee. Then he opened his portfolio and extracted a small notebook where he'd recorded the names of the corporate representatives he'd recognized at the auction. Agri Global, Continental Harvest, Meridian Farm Partners, Danson Agricultural Investments. Together, these entities controlled over 60% of the farmland in 3 surrounding counties. Their expansion into Riverside Valley would consolidate their influence further. For several minutes, Walter sat quietly, gathering his thoughts while sipping his coffee. The confrontation with Crawford had gone exactly as expected: dismissal, humiliation, ejection. Walter had anticipated all of it, had prepared himself emotionally for the public mockery. What mattered wasn't his pride, but ensuring that the watershed protections remained visible despite Crawford's attempts to bury them. After finishing half his coffee, Walter picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. "Earl? It's Walt." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "Yes, I went. No, it didn't go well." Another pause. "Crawford claimed the watershed protections were never finalized, called them proposed rather than implemented." Walter's weathered face tightened slightly at the memory. "Yes, I had the documentation with me. No, he wasn't interested in seeing it. Had security escort me out." Walter listened as Earl Peterson, the current head of the Riverside Valley Agricultural Council, expressed his frustration at Crawford's tactics. "The good news," Walter continued, "is that some of the investors seemed concerned. They were on their phones researching while I was being escorted out. At least a few of them aren't taking Crawford's word at face value." From the window beside his booth, Walter could see the auction house on the hill at the edge of town. Several expensive cars were now leaving the parking lot, suggesting the proceedings might have concluded, or perhaps been suspended due to the questions he'd raised. "Listen, Earl," Walter said, lowering his voice slightly though no one was close enough to overhear. "I think it's time to call Elizabeth. Crawford isn't going to acknowledge those protections unless someone with actual authority forces the issue." He listened to Earl's response, nodding slowly. "I know she's busy. The National Agricultural Preservation Foundation doesn't stop running just because we have a local problem. But this isn't just about Riverside Valley anymore. If Crawford gets away with selling land without disclosing these protections, it sets a precedent for other auctions across the state." Walter's relationship with his daughter was complex. Elizabeth Cahill, Ph.D., had risen from their small farming community to become a nationally recognized expert on sustainable agriculture and water conservation. Her appointment as director of the National Agricultural Preservation Foundation had placed her at the center of policy discussions in Washington. Walter was immensely proud of her accomplishments, but also aware of the tension that sometimes existed between them, his practical, hands-on approach occasionally clashing with her data-driven scientific perspective. "Yes," Walter continued, responding to Earl's concern. "I know she's presenting at that conference in Chicago this week, but she also has resources we don't. Legal teams, research staff, political connections. Crawford dismissed me as a stubborn old farmer. He won't be able to dismiss the foundation so easily." After finishing the call with Earl, Walter sat quietly for another moment, contemplating his next move. He had hoped to resolve this locally without involving Elizabeth. Their last conversation about the Riverside Valley situation had been tense. She advocating for systematic policy changes at the federal level, he focused on the immediate local impact of corporate land acquisition. Finally, Walter dialed his daughter's number, mentally preparing himself for what might be a difficult conversation. The call went directly to voicemail, not surprising given Elizabeth's packed schedule at the agricultural conference. "Elizabeth, it's Dad," he said after the beep. "I'm sorry to bother you during your conference, but there's a situation with the Riverside Valley auction that needs your attention. Crawford's selling all 12 properties without disclosing the watershed protections. I tried to raise the issue, but..." He paused, deciding to omit the details of his humiliation. "But I was asked to leave. The sale's happening now. Some of the biggest corporate operators are bidding: AgriGlobal, Continental, Meridian. If they purchase without acknowledging the protections, we'll be fighting enforcement battles for years." Walter hesitated before adding, "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. This isn't just about one valley or one watershed. It's about whether environmental protections mean anything when enough money is involved. Call me when you can." As he ended the call, Walter noticed a black SUV with tinted windows pulling into the diner's parking lot. Two men in suits emerged and entered the restaurant, scanning the interior before approaching Walter's booth. "Mr. Cahill?" the taller of the two asked, his tone professional but not unfriendly. Walter nodded cautiously. "My name is James Richardson, legal counsel for Meridian Farm Partners," the man said, gesturing to the empty seats across from Walter. "May we join you for a moment?" Walter gestured toward the booth, and the two men slid in opposite him. Marge appeared immediately with coffee pots in both hands, an eyebrow raised questioningly at Walter, who nodded to indicate everything was okay. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" Walter asked, after Marge had filled their cups and retreated. Richardson glanced at his colleague before responding. "Mr. Cahill, Meridian is seriously considering bidding on portions of the Riverside Valley portfolio, particularly parcels 6 through 9. Before committing significant capital, we'd like to understand more about the watershed protections you mentioned during the auction." Walter studied the men carefully, trying to gauge their sincerity. "I thought Mr. Crawford made it clear those protections were merely proposed rather than implemented," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful. Richardson smiled slightly. "Meridian prefers to conduct its own due diligence, Mr. Cahill. Our preliminary research suggests the watershed designations were indeed ratified and implemented, exactly as you stated." Walter relaxed marginally, recognizing that at least one potential buyer was taking the environmental regulations seriously. "In that case," Walter said, opening his portfolio and extracting the relevant documents, "I'm happy to share what I know about those protections and how they affect agricultural operations on the properties in question." As Walter spread the maps and documentation across the table, he was unaware that back at the auction house, Theodore Crawford was facing growing skepticism from multiple bidders who had independently verified the watershed protections. Nor did he know that his daughter Elizabeth had just stepped out of her conference presentation in Chicago to listen to his voicemail, her expression hardening as she heard the details of the situation in Riverside Valley. The quiet conversation in the small-town diner was about to have repercussions far beyond what either Walter or Theodore Crawford could anticipate. Back at the auction house, Theodore Crawford was struggling to maintain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation. What had begun as a routine, high-value agricultural land sale had descended into a morass of uncomfortable questions and hesitant bidders. The momentum Crawford had carefully cultivated through months of marketing and relationship building was evaporating before his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced from the podium, his voice carrying a forced confidence that fooled no one, "I understand your concerns about potential watershed restrictions. Our legal team is preparing a comprehensive addendum that will address these questions in detail. Perhaps we could proceed with bidding on the unaffected parcels while that information is being compiled." The corporate representatives exchanged glances, their reluctance evident. AgriGlobal's lead counsel stood, her expression professionally neutral, but her words damning. "Mr. Crawford, our preliminary research indicates that the watershed protections Mr. Cahill mentioned affect nearly 720 acres across the portfolio, substantially more than your team initially acknowledged. Given this discrepancy, we'll need to completely reassess our valuation model before proceeding with any bids." Similar sentiments were echoed by representatives from Continental Harvest and several other potential buyers. The carefully orchestrated auction was unraveling, with millions in commissions hanging in the balance. Crawford's legal team huddled in urgent consultation, their expressions conveying the seriousness of the situation. Crawford's assistant approached the podium, whispering urgently in his ear. He frowned, listening intently before nodding in acknowledgement. "And you. Seems we require a more extensive recess to address these concerns properly," Crawford announced, barely concealing his frustration. "We'll resume the auction in 1 hour. My team will provide updated disclosure documents addressing all watershed designations and their potential impact on agricultural operations." As the bidders filed out toward the reception area, many already on phones consulting with their headquarters, Crawford retreated to a private office with his legal team. The atmosphere was tense as they confronted the reality that significant environmental restrictions had been overlooked, or worse, deliberately minimized in their preparation materials. "How did we miss this?" Crawford demanded, pacing behind his desk while his lead counsel scrolled frantically through property records on his laptop. The designations were filed under a separate environmental conservation index, not with the standard property records, the attorney explained, his voice tight. "But they're legitimate, Ted, fully ratified and implemented in 1997, with compliance. Requirements that will significantly affect industrial agricultural operations on several key parcels." Crawford slammed his hand on the desk. "That old man was right about everything. Do you have any idea how this looks to our clients? We're supposed to be the experts on agricultural property transfers." Before the attorney could respond, Crawford's assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a breach of protocol that instantly conveyed the urgency of her message. "Mr. Crawford, there's a situation developing that requires your immediate attention. Unless it's a solution to our current disclosure disaster, it can wait," Crawford snapped. "Sir, a helicopter just landed in the east parking lot," she continued, unfazed by his irritation. "It's bearing the National Agricultural Preservation Foundation logo." Crawford froze, the color draining from his face. "The foundation? What are they doing here?" "Dr. Elizabeth Cahill has arrived with her legal team," the assistant continued. "She's requesting to address the auction participants regarding the watershed protections before bidding resumes." "Elizabeth Cahill," Crawford repeated, the name triggering an uneasy recognition. "The Foundation's director?" "Yes, sir." The assistant hesitated before adding, "And she's identified herself as Walter Cahill's daughter." The revelation struck Crawford like a physical blow. The elderly farmer he had so dismissively ejected, the man he had publicly humiliated before a room of investors, was the father of one of the most influential agricultural policy experts in the country. The implications cascaded through his mind in rapid succession, each more damaging than the last. "Where is she now?" Crawford asked, his voice unnaturally calm. "In the main lobby. She's asked to speak with you before addressing the bidders." Crawford straightened his tie and smoothed his jacket, buying seconds to compose himself. "Tell her I'll be right out, and find out where Walter Cahill is. We need to—" He searched for the appropriate phrase, "rectify the misunderstanding." From earlier, as his assistant departed, Crawford turned to his legal team. "Prepare complete disclosure documents on all watershed protections, every detail, every restriction, every compliance requirement. We need to demonstrate absolute transparency going forward." The attorneys nodded grimly, recognizing the severity of the situation. Crawford moved toward the door, pausing to check his reflection in a small mirror on the wall. The confident, authoritative auctioneer who had opened the proceedings hours earlier was gone, replaced by a man scrambling to salvage both a multi-million-dollar transaction and his professional reputation. In the main lobby, Dr. Elizabeth Cahill stood conversing quietly with representatives from several of the corporate bidders. At 45, she carried herself with the natural authority that comes from genuine expertise and conviction. Her tailored suit and practical short haircut projected professional competence without sacrificing the underlying warmth in her expression. From 20 feet away, Crawford could immediately see the resemblance to her father. The same clear blue eyes and direct gaze, though Elizabeth's features were softer. More striking was the identical quality of focused attention she gave to whoever was speaking, the same respect for others' perspectives that Walter had demonstrated before Crawford had so rudely dismissed him. As Crawford approached, Elizabeth turned toward him, her expression neutral but evaluative. The corporate representative stepped back slightly, creating space for what everyone recognized would be a pivotal conversation. "Dr. Cahill," Crawford began, extending his hand with a professional smile that belied his internal turmoil. "This is an unexpected honor. I'm Theodore Crawford, facilitating today's auction." Elizabeth accepted his handshake briefly, her grip firm and confident. "Mr. Crawford, I understand you've had some questions arise regarding watershed protections affecting the properties under auction today." Her tone was measured and professional, giving no indication of personal animosity despite what he had done to her father. This controlled response somehow made Crawford even more uncomfortable than outright anger would have. "Yes, there appears to have been some confusion regarding certain environmental designations," Crawford replied carefully. "My team is preparing comprehensive disclosure updates as we speak." Elizabeth nodded slightly. "I'm glad to hear that. The Foundation has a particular interest in ensuring these watershed protections are fully acknowledged in any transfer of the affected properties. They represent one of the earliest comprehensive water quality initiatives in the region and have become a model for similar programs nationwide." Around them, auction participants had gathered at a respectful distance, clearly interested in the exchange. Crawford was acutely aware of being observed by the very clients whose trust he had potentially compromised. "Of course," he agreed quickly. "Transparency is our highest priority. I've directed my team to prepare detailed documentation on all relevant restrictions." Elizabeth's expression remained neutral. "I appreciate that commitment. I should mention that I've spoken with my father about his experience here earlier today." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Crawford felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck as he realized she knew exactly how he had treated Walter Cahill. "There appears to have been an unfortunate misunderstanding," Crawford said, choosing his words with extreme care. "Your father raised important points about the watershed designations, but the format of an active auction made it difficult to address them properly in real time." "I see," Elizabeth replied, her tone making it clear she understood exactly what had happened. "Well, I'm here now with my legal team to ensure there are no further misunderstandings about these critical environmental protections." Before Crawford could respond, the lobby doors opened again, drawing all eyes toward the entrance. Walter Cahill stepped inside, still carrying his leather portfolio, accompanied by James Richardson from Meridian Farm Partners. Walter paused, momentarily upon seeing the gathered crowd, his eyes finding his daughter across the room. Elizabeth's professional demeanor softened visibly as she walked toward her father, embracing him briefly before turning back to Crawford. The contrast between Crawford's earlier treatment of Walter and the obvious respect with which others now regarded him was stark and uncomfortable. "Mr. Crawford," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed lobby, "I believe you and my father have some unfinished business regarding the Riverside Valley watershed protections. Perhaps we should address these issues together before the auction resumes." Crawford nodded, acutely aware that his priority had shifted from salvaging the auction to salvaging his reputation. "Of course, Dr. Cahill. My office would be the appropriate venue for that discussion." As the three of them moved toward the private office area, Crawford caught the expressions on the faces of auction participants, a mixture of curiosity, professional interest, and in some cases, poorly concealed satisfaction at his discomfort. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone in the room knew it. The elderly farmer in worn overalls, who had been forcibly ejected from the auction hall, was now returning alongside his daughter, one of the most respected agricultural policy experts in the country, while Theodore Crawford, who had so confidently dismissed Walter's concerns hours earlier, was visibly scrambling to adapt to this dramatic reversal of fortune. Crawford's spacious office now felt uncomfortably crowded, not due to the number of people inside, but the palpable shift in authority that had occurred. The sleek mahogany desk that typically reinforced his position of power now seemed more like a barrier behind which he was retreating. Walter Cahill sat opposite him, still in his worn overalls, but now flanked by his daughter and two members of the Foundation's legal team, their credentials undeniable. "Let's be clear about what happened earlier," Elizabeth began, her voice calm but direct. "My father attempted to inform you and your bidders about legally binding watershed protections that materially affect the properties under auction. Instead of incorporating this critical information, you had him removed from the premises and publicly dismissed his concerns." Crawford shifted in his leather chair. "As I mentioned, there was a misunderstanding about the regulatory status of those protections." "There was no misunderstanding," Elizabeth countered, placing a folder on the desk between them. "Our foundation maintains the National Database of Watershed Conservation Initiatives. The Riverside Valley protections were fully implemented and have been continuously enforced since 1997. She opened the folder, revealing maps and legal documentation far more comprehensive than even Walter's portfolio had contained. "These protections restrict agricultural runoff, require maintenance of riparian buffers, and prohibit certain chemicals on approximately 720 acres across the portfolio you're auctioning today," she continued. "Any buyer has a right to know these restrictions before bidding." Crawford's legal counsel leaned forward, examining the documentation with growing concern. "These appear to align with what we've just verified ourselves," he admitted reluctantly. Elizabeth turned to Walter. "Dad, would you please show Mr. Crawford Your documentation as well, the records you attempted to present earlier. Walter opened his portfolio, extracting the very papers Crawford had refused to examine hours before. The auctioneer now studied them carefully, his face tightening as he recognized identical government seals and signatures to those in the Foundation's more extensive records. The information was available to you, Elizabeth noted, her tone measured but firm. You chose not to consider it. Crawford glanced toward his legal team, finding no support as they continued reviewing the overwhelming documentation. The power hierarchy in the room had completely inverted. The auctioneer who had orchestrated sales of thousands of acres now found himself on the defensive, while the elderly farmer who had been humiliated and ejected now sat with quiet dignity, as his concerns were meticulously validated. We've drafted a complete disclosure addendum, Elizabeth continued, sliding another document across the desk. This outlines all watershed protections affecting the auction properties, with precise acreage calculations and compliance requirements. We expect this to be distributed to all bidders before the auction resumes. It wasn't a request, but a statement. Of fact, Crawford nodded slowly, recognizing that his options had narrowed to a single path forward. Of course, Dr. Cahill will ensure complete transparency moving forward. Elizabeth held his gaze steadily. Additionally, I believe a public clarification regarding my father's earlier statements would be appropriate when the auction reconvenes. Crawford swallowed hard, understanding exactly what was being demanded of him, a public acknowledgement that Walter Cahill had been right all along. The auction hall had filled again, buzzing with speculative conversations about the unexpected recess and the dramatic arrival of the National Agricultural Preservation Foundation's helicopter. Corporate representatives huddled in small groups, recalculating valuations and reassessing bidding strategies in light of the watershed protection revelations. The mysterious connection between the elderly farmer who had been removed and the Foundation's sudden intervention was the primary topic of whispered discussions. Theodore Crawford approached the podium with none of his earlier confidence. The room quieted immediately. All eyes focused on the auctioneer, whose smooth certainty had been replaced by a careful formality. On either side of the podium stood Walter Cahill and Dr. Elizabeth Cahill, their presence fundamentally altering the power dynamics of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Crawford began, his voice carrying less authority than before we resume bidding, I must provide important clarifications regarding the Riverside Valley properties. As Mr. Cahill attempted to explain earlier today, there are significant watershed protections affecting approximately 720 acres across the portfolio. He gestured to his assistant, who began distributing detailed documentation to all registered bidders. These comprehensive disclosure addendums outline all environmental restrictions, their legal status, and their impact on potential agricultural operations. I apologize for the earlier confusion and thank the National Agricultural Preservation Foundation for their assistance in ensuring complete transparency in today's proceedings. Crawford paused, visibly uncomfortable with what came next, but continuing nonetheless. I also owe a personal apology to Mr. Walter Cahill, who was correct about these watershed protections and was attempting to ensure all bidders had accurate information when I inappropriately dismissed his concerns. A murmur ran through the crowd as Crawford's gaze shifted toward Walter, who acknowledged the apology with a slight nod but remained otherwise impassive. Crawford cleared his throat before continuing. What I failed to recognize earlier, what many of us failed to recognize, is that Mr. Cahill speaks with considerable authority on these matters, having helped establish these protections during his 16 years on the Tri-County Water Board. He hesitated again before adding the revelation that changed everything. I should also note, for those who haven't yet made the connection, that Mr. Walter Cahill is the father of Dr. Elizabeth Cahill, Director of the National Agricultural Preservation Foundation, who has joined us to ensure these watershed protections are properly acknowledged in today's transactions. The room fell completely silent as the corporate representatives processed this information. The elderly farmer in worn overalls, whom Crawford had mockingly dismissed as irrelevant, the man he had publicly humiliated and ejected from the proceedings, was the father of one of the most influential agricultural policy experts in the country. Several bidders who had laughed at Crawford's earlier dismissal of Walter now looked distinctly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with both Cahills. Others studied Walter with new interest, reassessing the man they had so quickly discounted based on his appearance. Elizabeth stepped forward to stand beside her father, their family resemblance now obvious to everyone in the room. The same clear blue eyes, the same quiet dignity, the same unwavering commitment to environmental stewardship, though expressed through different means. The Riverside Valley Watershed Protections. Elizabeth addressed the room, her voice carrying the natural authority of genuine expertise, represent an early model of agricultural conservation that balances productive farming with water quality preservation. My father helped create this framework decades before it became standard practice nationwide. When the auction finally concluded 3 hours later than scheduled, the Riverside Valley properties had sold for a combined $43 million, substantially less than Crawford's projected $55–60 million, but still a significant transaction. More importantly, each buyer had signed acknowledgements of the watershed protections, committing to maintain the conservation requirements that Walter had fought to preserve. Walter stood in the nearly empty auction hall, his leather portfolio tucked under his arm as he gazed at the property maps still displayed on the screens. Elizabeth approached after finishing a conversation with representatives from AgriGlobal, who had purchased 3 of the 12 parcels. They're actually interested in implementing advanced sustainable practices on the protected acreage, she told her father, genuine surprise in her voice. Their corporate headquarters is pushing regional managers to demonstrate environmental leadership. Apparently, it's becoming good business. Walter nodded, a hint of a smile touching his weathered face. Land has a way of teaching everyone eventually. Some just take longer to learn than others. Elizabeth studied her father, seeing beyond the worn clothing to the wisdom and persistence that had shaped her own career path, though they had sometimes disagreed on methods. I'm sorry I didn't take your concerns more seriously when you first called about the auction. I was caught up in policy meetings and thought it was just another one of Dad's local battles. Walter finished for her, his tone gentle rather. In an accusatory, Elizabeth nodded, acknowledging the truth in his assessment. The policies you work on in Washington matter, Walter said, placing a calloused hand on her shoulder. But so do the streams and soil right here. One protects the other. They stood in companionable silence, father and daughter united in purpose despite their different approaches. The quiet moment contained no triumph or celebration, just the satisfaction of knowing that the watershed protections would remain intact, that the land would continue to be stewarded responsibly despite changing ownership. Across the room, Theodore Crawford was overseeing the final paperwork, his earlier arrogance replaced by subdued efficiency. He glanced occasionally toward the Cahills, his expression unreadable, but his body language conveying a new awareness of having underestimated them both, a mistake he would not make again. You know, Elizabeth said softly, Crawford actually approached me about consulting on environmental compliance for future auctions, said my expertise would be valuable in ensuring proper disclosures. Walter's eyes crinkled slightly. And what did you tell him? That the Foundation would be happy to provide guidance, and that I knew an experienced local consultant who understands the practical implementation of watershed protections better than anyone. Walter raised an eyebrow questioningly. I gave him your number, Dad, Elizabeth explained, "told him you'd be available for consulting at your standard rate." For the first time that day, Walter laughed, a warm, genuine sound that carried no bitterness despite the day's earlier humiliation. His victory wasn't in Crawford's discomfort or public apology, but in the protection of something that mattered far more: the watershed that sustained his community. As they walked together toward the exit, Walter paused to look back at the auction. Hall 1, last time. "You know, your mother would have enjoyed today," he said quietly. "Particularly the part where you arrived in that helicopter." Elizabeth smiled, slipping her arm through her father's. "She always did say you were stubborn enough for both of you." "Not stubborn," Walter corrected gently as they stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. "Just persistent when something matters." 6 months later, the Riverside Valley Annual Agricultural Conference convened in the same auction house where Walter Cahill had once been humiliated and ejected. The building had undergone a subtle but meaningful transformation. Historical photographs of the valley's farming families once again lined the entrance hall, and the conference agenda prominently featured sessions on sustainable agriculture, alongside discussions of market trends and technological innovations. Theodore Crawford moved through the crowded reception area, greeting attendees with a noticeably different demeanor than he had displayed at the auction. His designer suit remained impeccable, but the aggressive confidence had been replaced by something more measured and thoughtful. He paused beside a display featuring the Riverside Valley Watershed Protection Initiative, studying the maps that highlighted the protected areas he had once tried to minimize. "Quite a change from the last time we were all in this building," observed Walter Cahill, approaching with a cup of coffee in hand. His overalls had been replaced by a simple button-down shirt and khakis for the occasion, though his work boots remained. Crawford nodded in acknowledgement. "Change was overdue," he admitted. "Your daughter's foundation has been instrumental in helping us develop a more comprehensive approach to agricultural property transitions. Elizabeth tells me your new disclosure protocols are being adopted by auction houses in 3 other states," Walter noted. 4 states now, Crawford corrected. "Turns out transparency about environmental protections doesn't devalue properties. It attracts the right kind of buyers and prevents problems down the line." What had begun as an embarrassing confrontation had evolved into something neither man could have predicted: a working relationship based on reluctant respect. Crawford's company now routinely consulted with Walter on local environmental conditions before bringing agricultural properties to auction, while Walter had gained a platform to ensure watershed protections were properly communicated to potential buyers. Across the room, Elizabeth Cahill was engaged in conversation with representatives from several agricultural corporations, including AgriGlobal, which had implemented innovative, sustainable practices on their Riverside Valley properties. The once adversarial relationship between environmental advocates and corporate agriculture was evolving into something more collaborative, if still occasionally tense. "Your conservation knowledge consultant role seems to be working out," Crawford observed, gesturing toward the conference program where Walter was listed as a featured speaker. Walter smiled slightly. "Turns out there's market value in knowing which fields flood first in heavy rains and where the natural springs maintain flow during drought years. Information that doesn't show up in satellite imagery or soil sample reports." The transformation wasn't just in Crawford's approach to auctions or Walter's new consulting role. The entire framework for agricultural land transfers in the region had shifted. Environmental protections were no longer treated as obstacles to be minimized, but as essential elements of property valuation and management planning. As the conference, attendees moved toward the main hall for opening presentations. Walter paused at a window overlooking the valley that had been his home for over 7 decades. The patchwork of fields stretched toward the horizon, Silver Creek winding through them like a blue ribbon. Some parcels now belonged to corporate entities, others remained in family ownership, but all were bound by the watershed protections he had fought to maintain. "We've come a long way from that auction day," Crawford acknowledged, following Walter's gaze across the landscape. Walter nodded, his expression peaceful. "The land remembers how it's treated," he said quietly, echoing the words he had spoken when being ejected from the auction. "And sometimes, if we're fortunate, so do people." The elderly farmer and the auctioneer stood side by side, their former antagonism transformed into an unlikely alliance that was helping to create a new model for balancing agricultural productivity with environmental stewardship, a model that honored both innovation and tradition, profit and preservation in the ongoing story of American farmland. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.